Greetings. I'd like to welcome our audience to this community forum show on the Downtown Zoning Article 24. I'm Joe Scardino. I'm chairman of the planning board, and I'm pleased to have with me for this program the town planner for the town of Stoughton, John Charbonneau. John, thank you for taking time out from your schedule to inform and meet with us with respect to this important initiative for the town. I'd like to start off by asking John to give us a little brief overview and introduction before we actually talk about Article 24, and he's going to set the table for the changes that we're going to be discussing and that'll be appearing on May 2nd at town meeting. John, thank you and greetings.
Thank you, Joe. Glad to be here. When I was hired almost 3 years ago as the town planner for Stoughton, it was in May of 2019. The rezoning of the downtown area was the top priority that was assigned to me. So work began on this project pretty much right away after I was hired. And an article was put forward at the special town meeting in December of 2019 to appropriate $50,000 for the hiring of a consultant to assist the town with this task. The consultants, Horsley Witten, were subsequently hired in early 2020, very early, I believe February of 2020, and shortly thereafter work began in earnest on the bylaw. A working group of town staff was appointed by the town manager right around this time in February or March of 2020, and the first meeting was held in May of 2020. And then right after that, the consultants and myself met with various town boards, such as the planning board, the downtown task force, and the select board to receive feedback on where they thought the downtown should go and what their vision for the downtown is. Then work began on a resident survey that was distributed and made available in August of 2020 and was available for about 4 to 5 weeks through Labor Day, and 800 responses were received, which was very impressive, especially considering that the survey was done completely by social media, email, and online because of the pandemic at the time. So that survey and the responses to that survey formed the basis of discussion to begin the draft bylaw. And that draft bylaw went through several iterations until it came into final form as it's currently presented to town meeting. And I'm happy to announce that this bylaw has the support of the planning board, the downtown task force, the redevelopment authority, as well as the Friends of Stoughton Center. So this has been through a very thorough public vetting process with multiple public forums held in June and September of 2021, as well as 3 different public hearings before the planning board in October of 2021, and then January and March of 2022. So that's how we got here today.
John, I'd like to go back to the social media survey that was taken. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us some of the observations that came out of that survey?
Sure. One of the main observations, one of the first ones, was that the name of the zoning district needed to be changed from the schmood to something simpler and more descriptive. The other thing that came out of that survey, another result, was the fact that people really wanted to see zoning that was more flexible and encouraged the type of development that the town wanted to see in the town center, since the current zoning is confusing and inconsistent in some ways and has not encouraged the type of development that the town wants to see. Residents were also supportive of some increased building height in the downtown. I believe 60% of respondents supported the idea of 5 or 6 story buildings in the core subdistrict, which is along Washington Street in the central business district. So those are some of the observations that we got from the survey, was that people were very supportive of also more flexible options in terms of on-site and off-site parking for mixed use and commercial developments in the core subdistrict. So they were supportive of that type of flexibility.
I certainly would like to embellish a little on what John said. The 2 years ago, it's actually a little more than 2 years ago, there was a focus on parking in the downtown, and as a result of the Malcolm Parsons project. And at that point in time, the parking component was liberalized to go from 500 to 1,300 feet with some other restrictions attached to it. And even that, in the 2 years that it was on the books, didn't result in any new permits being requested for the downtown area with just that change. So at that point, it became patently obvious that we needed to bring in some big guns, which we did with the consultant, Horsley Witten, to help us, because the Band-Aid approach that we had been taking in the past, since 2006, when the current bylaw was put into place, hasn't resulted in development of any kind, basically. Then that was the intent of the original bylaw, was to have those buildings repurposed so that we would have a vibrant downtown, which, by the way, was one of the major points and objectives of the master plan in 2015 that was adopted by the town, that the overwhelming majority of people wanted a vibrant downtown center. And so this iteration of the bylaw has been drafted and designed to effectuate that goal of the master plan. John, I think it's time to unwrap the bylaw and talk about Article 24, which will be in front of us sometime after May 2nd. And would you enlighten us on some of the major features of the bylaw?
Sure. If I could, I'd like to pull up a brief PowerPoint presentation to describe the important elements of the bylaw that are going to be coming before the town. Next slide, please. So, as I stated previously, this has been thoroughly discussed in public over the past 2 to 2.5 years. The Downtown Redevelopment Task Force has held at least 15 discussions publicly on this bylaw over the past 2.5 years. The Planning Board has had this on their agenda at least 25 times. Now, some of those instances were updates that I provided to the board to update them on what was discussed previously at a task force meeting or with the consultants, but a lot of those were substantial, lengthy discussions. And in addition, the Redevelopment Authority has held at least 3 public discussions on this over that time period. Next slide, please. So, in short, the reason that the current bylaw has not worked is that the regulations are confusing and at times conflicting with each other, and it makes that confusing not just for developers, but for the planning board and also town staff to interpret. One example is that the composition of the first story in the central business district along Washington Street is not well delineated in this current bylaw. So when regulations are complicated and restrictive and contradictory, it tends to discourage developers from coming forward, because developers really want a predictable, clear permitting path and review path, which behooves the town because it gives the town some flexibility to work with developers as well. Next slide.
John, before you start the next slide, I just wanted to bring up a point. You mentioned about the confusing, and I would like to say from the planning board perspective, one of the areas that has caused us the most difficulty in dealing with applicants who've come in is this concept of an overlay district over, I believe it's 3 or 4?
Four underlying zoning districts.
4 different underlying zoning districts. And a zoning district has its own operating rules. So you've got four sets of operating rules which aren't exactly complementary. So what you had with the 2006 version of the overlay is an opportunity to set aside, depending on which zoning district the site was in, to use the overlay as a independent set of rules and regulations for building in that area. What developers, engineers, architects thought they could do was to pick and choose. And so they would come in with a first design, and that design would contain elements of the underlying zoning district as well as the overlay. And the filing requires you to decide which direction you're going. And they were trying to have it every which way. And that caused delay, it caused confusion, it added expense for applicants, and overall it stymied development. So I wanted to share that particular point with our audience today. Sorry to interrupt, John,
That's okay.
but we'll continue with your next slide.
Thank you. And I'd like to add on to what was just stated as far as why the current bylaw hasn't worked is normally the idea of an overlay district is to provide additional flexibility over what the underlying districts normally allow. In this case, there are actually some uses and some regulations of the overlay district that are more restrictive than the underlying district. So it kind of defeats the purpose of having an overlay district. So how does the Stoughton Center bylaw improve things? So it creates one consistent zoning district named the Stoughton Center District with three sub-districts. Now, in the orange, you'll see the core, which allows taller buildings with more density and limits residential to the upper floors. Again, this would be typically your central business district, as it were. The flex district in the green allows moderate height and density, more uses allowed, and residential allowed on all floors. And finally, the blue transition district allows shorter buildings, less density, and limited commercial uses. And there was a lot of discussion and a lot of thought. And also there was a site walk to accompany this where a group walked the entire district back in February of 2021 that included representatives from the Planning Board, the Downtown Task Force, the Redevelopment Authority. I was there, the consultants were there. We walked this entire area and actually looked at each property to determine where the boundaries of these subdistricts could be. And the goal was to have the most intense development in the core and then have it be graduated as you expand outward to not only complement the core subdistrict, but also protect the residential neighborhoods that abut this downtown area. So the other aspect of this that really improves things from what is currently regulated is this is its own zoning district with its own unique name. The underlying districts, such as the residential or the central business district, the general business district, in this area no longer exist, and that benefits the town because now, if this bylaw gets changed going forward, the town does not have to worry about changes to this area affecting other similarly zoned areas in town. So it really creates a unique zoning district for this area because this area is unique and unlike other areas of Stoughton. So that's an important aspect of this, is it really gives the town flexibility going forward with this area to make changes to this bylaw without having an effect in other areas of Stoughton. Next slide, please. So the proposed minimum lot sizes have been reduced from what's in the bylaws currently, and this was done in consultation with representatives of the Downtown Task Force who work in private commercial development, because what you have right now are you have a lot of non-conforming lots because the minimum lot size is too large, and I think that was done originally with the intention of encouraging developers to consolidate their sites and build something more substantial, but that really does not happen very often. And also what that does is that actually encourages larger developments where it may not be appropriate. So what the intention of this was to allow these smaller lots to be developed without having to be consolidated, which is actually a benefit, because what it does is it limits the amount of larger buildings you can have in this area. So that's the message that came through, was what the private sector wanted was more flexibility to develop the lots they had, and not necessarily be forced to combine lots with another property owner. And because it's been shown that this strategy does not work, because we have a lot of small lots that have simply not been developed. Next
John,
slide. Yes.
I think that just to clarify something, zoning is full of a lot of nomenclature, and I think it might behoove us to have you explain what non-conforming means.
Correct. So what you have is, when you have a lot that has been in existence for a long time, previous to current zoning regulations, it's considered a pre-existing non-conforming lot. So what happens is whatever the building is or the use is on that lot is allowed to continue. However, if something changes on that lot, if the use changes, if something is proposed on that lot, it's not simply a change of ownership. If there is some kind of use or physical change to that lot that requires an approval from the planning board or the zoning board of appeals, then that property owner has to come into compliance with whatever the current zoning regulations are. So when the schmood was developed and the minimum lot size was established at 10,000 square feet, if there was a lot that was below that, say the lot had 3,500 square feet, it doesn't mean that the use had to discontinue and was illegal. It just meant that whenever a change of use or a physical change required approval from a town board, then that property would have to come into compliance or seek a variance from the zoning board of appeals, which is not always an easy thing to do.
And why is that a big problem? Did we look at the number of lots that exist in this footprint of the downtown center and find that the disproportionality of lots that met the 10,000?
Absolutely. I believe when we, with the help of Larry Langley, our excellent GIS director, when we started analyzing the various lots in the downtown area, I think we found approximately 75 pre-existing non-conforming lots, around that number. I believe it was 75 to 80 pre-existing non-conforming lots. What the new dimensional regulations will allow, it will decrease that number of non-conforming lots to, I believe, about 15 non-conforming lots. So it really makes things a lot easier in terms of developing those lots. And when you look at these smaller lots, what can be done on those lots really is constricted by that lot size. So when you look at the bylaw and the dimensional regulations and the building height, the size of those lots will really help determine what can be done on those lots.
Thank you, John. Continue with your presentation.
Thank you. And this is simply, I want to let people know that these illustrations will show what the building height would look like under the regulations that are proposed. And I will just advise people that these are rough renderings to give people a sense of scope and scale. They do not include design features such as building facade or roof treatments that could make the building look much nicer, much more complementary to the town character. It's simply meant as for a comparison analysis of visual representation. Next slide, please.
John, can we go back to that one for a minute?
Sure.
Because I want to talk about the, later on we're going to talk about the building height issue, but this illustrates one of the features of the bylaw, which is the step back of the front and side facades for corner lots. Would you
Actually,
speak?
This illustration doesn't show the fifth story, Joe. It shows the 4 stories. However, one important element of the fifth story by special permit, it's not allowed by right, it's by special permit, is that the 5th story will need to be set back a minimum of 10 feet from the edge of the building along any side that faces a public roadway. So in the case of a corner lot, 2 of the sides would have to be stepped back at least 10 feet from the edge of the building. So it would not give the appearance of a 55-foot, 5-story building from the street level.
So in other words, if we were driving through the square, it wouldn't look as cavernous as it
Exactly.
would be if we didn't have this requirement in there.
And I've overheard conversations and been involved with conversations with residents who use, for instance, the town of Mansfield as an example, and driving through their town center and the feel that it gives them of buildings, driving by buildings that have that type of scale. So a lot of thought was put into if a fifth story goes in by special permit, not to have the feel of a fifth story building. And it would also allow the property owner to do something with that 10 feet that the fifth story step back, to put in some kind of landscaping or put in some kind of terrace seating or balcony seating, which would enhance the property.
Thank you, John.
Next slide, please. So what it will look like, here's an example of the data that was collected from the survey. Like I said, approximately 60% of respondents actually supported a 5 or 6 story building in the downtown. However, when this aspect was discussed by the planning board and the downtown task force, etc., it was determined that 6 stories was inappropriate, that 6 stories was too much for this town center, so it got reduced to 5 stories with that step back stipulation. And also the allowance by special permit, which is not allowed by right. Therefore, a property owner would have to show a design that would be appropriate for that building to allow a 5th story. So it's not a one size fits all. It would be considered on a case by case basis by the planning board.
Again, I'd like you to explain for those people that haven't attended any of our planning board meetings the difference between the standards for briefly for a site plan approval versus a special permit.
Right. So when I say something is allowed by right, it doesn't mean that it's allowed to go forward without a public hearing before the planning board. It would require site plan review. However, site plan approval is not normally a denial mechanism. It's meant as a mechanism for the planning board and the public to review a project and impose reasonable mitigation measures for that property to mitigate any adverse impacts it may have on the surrounding area. As opposed to a special permit that has to meet various thresholds according to state law in order to receive approval. So it is much more difficult to deny a project seeking site plan review as opposed to a special permit.
And is there a difference in the number of favorable votes that has to?
Absolutely, yes. A site plan approval requires a simple majority vote of the planning board, which would be 3 out of 5 members, as opposed to a special permit that requires a minimum of 2/3, which would be 4 out of 5 planning board members to approve it.
And in terms of appeal, can you explain how each one of those is appealed?
Yes, actually, they're actually appealed similarly. They both have a 20-day appeal period after approval, within which any resident can file an appeal with the town clerk. And if that does happen, then I believe the appeal goes back to the Zoning Board of Appeals for a public hearing before them.
What about the special permit?
Special permit, yes, I believe that also goes, if I'm correct, again, if I misspeak, please correct me. That actually goes back to the Zoning Board of Appeals.
I believe the special permit actually can go into the court system, where
It can.
The planning board becomes the trial court for special permits. But I will say that the special permit gives a lot of deference to the local planning boards. The standards to revoke a decision on a special permit by a planning board is very difficult to do at the court levels. So there's very few cases of special permits being overturned by courts, and they're not as interested in getting into the weeds, which is what oftentimes a denial of a special permit is. But for purposes of explaining why the addition of the 5th story is not exactly a romp in the park, we wanted to discuss with you the process briefly. John, you may continue.
Slide, please. So the other aspect of this is that in order to get a 5th story by special permit with that 10-foot step back, the applicant would need to provide a community benefit back to the community. And the bylaw includes, I believe, 5 or 6 different options for community benefits. And it could include anything from provision of additional public parking. It could be additional affordable housing units above and beyond the minimum requirement in the bylaw. It could be improvements to the public realms, such as either pedestrian or traffic safety improvements, things along those lines. So, or it could be the provision of additional open space. Those are all things that can be discussed and would be discussed at the public hearing for an individual project.
I believe there's also the ability to pay in a cash payment to the town, which would go into the, at this point, it would go into the general fund, but if this bylaw were passed, we could set up a gift account under Chapter 53A, and that money could be purposed specifically for improvements to the downtown. Right. For example, traffic, parking enforcement, metering, green space, other physical enhancements. And my recollection is that is 25% of the assessed value of the 5th floor. And that would be amount of money paid in up front by the developer. Right. So the town would get some direct cash benefits. The other community benefit options could be characterized as community benefit amenities as opposed to cash coming into the town. But again, there are a lot of strings attached to this 5th floor. John talked earlier about the setbacks. And as I said, even with a special permit, you still have to have the community benefit option satisfied in order to get the 5th story. Anything else you want to add to that, John?
No. Next slide, please. Parking has been another hot topic. What we heard from private developers is that the parking requirements make various properties, especially the non-conforming lots, undevelopable. So the parking has been reduced, and as you can see in the slide, 71% of respondents expressed support for the elimination of minimum parking requirements in the core subdistrict and to allow property owners to solve the issue with creative solutions on a case-by-case basis. The bylaw doesn't go that far. It eliminates the minimum requirement for commercial non-residential properties. However, the minimum parking is 1/2 parking space per unit of residential. Now, this is simply a minimum. I have spoken with private developers who have stated that they intend on continuing to provide parking that goes above and beyond that because that is simply what their tenants look for. But it also gives the flexibility for a developer whose tenants want to take advantage of the commuter rail, the opportunity to put in a development that has less parking for people who are going to walk to the commuter rail station. So it provides that flexibility. And a downtown parking analysis was conducted in 2018 that indicated that there is ample parking supply that is currently underutilized. And this is something that the town, I believe, needs to look at in terms of directing motorists to the available public parking that's available. Next slide, please.
And John, I didn't want to move off the parking topic for a minute, and to talk about the fact that with respect to the parking requirement, as the downtown gets fully developed, I want to go back to the special permit process. One of the factors that the planning board has to look at by law is the impact on the neighborhood. And so if we were deluged by applications, and I'll give you an example of where how this gets brought to the attention of the planning board. Back in my early days in the planning board, there was a bumper crop of applications for cell towers. And that raised the question in my mind and other members of the planning board as to how many towers we had in the town. And at that time, I believe it was 8 or 9, and we had 3 in the queue. And so we had to immediately reflect on the fact that do we want the town filled up with cell towers, and if so, where do we want them? Where the cell companies wanted them, or do we want them where the town wanted them? They had the least visual impact on the neighborhood. So the same concerns are true with parking. If we have a series of developments that are seeking the fifth story and have challenges with respect to parking, we have a right under the special permit process to deny those. Again, that's a big difference between by right and special permits. Special permits are considered an exception to the general rule, but they allow the planning board a lot of discretion with respect to that, but then they require the planning board to have 4/5 of its members to approve a particular special permit.
Joe, could I add to that, please?
Sure.
The other thing I want to make clear is, and this is part of the reason I mentioned the smaller lots and the number of pre-existing non-conforming lots, undersized lots that exist in the town center. There are only so many lots in the core subdistrict that could potentially accommodate a fifth story by special permit. There are only a certain number of lots that could actually accommodate 4 stories. So it's not as if once this bylaw goes in, we're going to see overnight all these projects coming in for 4 or 5 stories, because there are only a certain number of lots that can accommodate a building that size. Because cell towers are obviously something that are its own entity. So I want to point that out, that not all of the lots in the core subdistrict can accommodate 4 or 5 stories, because not all properties in the core currently have 4-story buildings, which are allowed by right under the current bylaw. So I want to make that clear, that there are a limited number of properties that could actually accommodate 4 or 5 stories in the core subdistrict.
In addition to that, John, I'd like to add that one of the revisions that you proposed early in your tenure in the town was a change to the site plan review bylaw, which requires a pre-application meeting.
Right.
So nobody's going to be running to the counter at the engineering department filing these things all at once.
Correct.
Because there is a requirement in the site plan review bylaw, and any building that is the size of which we're talking about would be required to come in for a pre-application meeting. And so the town will be put on notice that we have a project of this size and complexity coming in. So there are a lot of safeguards built into the system. We're not going to have 10 developers coming in the day after this bylaw passes. I think that too often we as a town are concerned about the worst case, and we have this idea that Armageddon is going to come in the next day after passing a bylaw. And I just want to reassure the public that there are steps in place, the special permit process, the pre-application process, where the town will get a heads up that perhaps we want to put the brakes on something. Johnny, you have anything further to say on
Nope.
that? Thank you.
Next slide, please. So in conclusion, this bylaw represents the culmination of an extensive, thorough public vetting process. The role of myself as the town planner and the role of the consultants assisting the town with this bylaw was to do this type of outreach and make sure that this bylaw got thoroughly reviewed by the public, by the various town boards as much as possible. And what you see in the bylaw represents a consensus of the information and the data that was gathered and the various outreach measures that were conducted. The value of the downtown properties is at a point right now where absentee ownership is an issue. In other words, you do have some absentee landlords that really don't have motivation to fill those spaces because the property values are depressed, and it's actually more financially beneficial for them to take the tax break from having a vacant, unoccupied space or building.
And just wait it out.
Right. So also the zoning regulations serve as the foundation. In other words, the zoning is the foundation. It's the beginning. It's not the end. In other words, there are going to be other things that the town needs to do going forward in the future to make a vibrant downtown, such as additional pedestrian and traffic safety measures. I would recommend that sometime in the future that the town take that 2018 parking analysis and reopen it and expand it and look at different options for public parking in terms of looking at the parallel parking on Washington Street, looking at the idea. I've heard people mention the idea of metered parking at some point in the future in strategic areas. So I think these are all options that need to be looked at. But to Joe's point, once this bylaw is implemented, it's not meant to have a spark of development all at once. But this bylaw is put into place to allow the downtown to evolve over time and to be revitalized over time. So there are going to be various streetscaping aspects that the town may want to look at, such as decorative lighting, signage, things of that nature.
You want to explain to our audience the process from the first draft and how the impact of the survey and some of the community outreach meetings affected the structure and content of the bylaw?
Well, the survey obviously came first. The survey came first before a draft bylaw was developed because, again, that served as the basis because 800 responses is excellent. From what I understand, that far exceeds the responses from any other survey that the town has done. But yeah, it formed the basis of it, but then there were discussions held among the planning board, the downtown task force, the redevelopment authority, as an example, in terms of how these bylaws would work in terms of actual development. And that's where the feedback of the private sector really was a benefit, and the site walk was really a benefit. And we did receive comments at the public forums from various individuals in terms of, having questions in terms of actual aspects of the bylaw. And we made sure that there was as much flexibility as possible. I know one of the things that has come up and has been a hot button topic is the future of the post office property, for example. And this bylaw has that flexibility where if at some point in the future the opportunity presents itself for that property to be redeveloped to be a public park or open space, that is a possibility because that is an allowed use by right within this bylaw. So that's what this bylaw does. It provides a menu of allowed uses. It provides a menu of dimensional regulations or minimum dimensional regulations that give flexibility not just to the developer but to the town to work with developers to attract development that the town wants that will maintain the town character.
I think that perhaps at this point in the program, we ought to, being a informational purposed presentation, I think it's fair to discuss some of the negative comments that have come in and get your take on those comments and talk about how the bylaw addresses those.
Absolutely. One of the issues that has been brought to my attention is the fifth story by special permit. That has been viewed. Some people are unsure about that provision for a fifth story. Again, the aspects we've talked about, that was addressed. The survey, like I said, 60% of people expressed support for either a fifth or sixth story, but we didn't go to a sixth story because that would be on the extreme end. We put in the fifth story with the step back requirements allowed by special permit and not by right for a reason to give the town some measure of control over that, and also with the community benefit option being provided back to the town by developers in exchange for that. So that's how we address the provision of the fifth story. So a building with a fifth story would not have the appearance of a five-story building. So that was vitally important. So it gives the developer an opportunity to make a property more valuable and attract development, but it gives the town some flexibility as far as the impact of that fifth story. Another item that has come up is the parking. I know there's going to be some hesitancy in terms of the reduction in parking, and that's understandable. However, it will make these properties more attractive. It will allow developers to take advantage of the commuter rail station that's within walking distance. And as Joe stated, over time, as these projects come forward, the planning board, when they review these public projects coming forward, and by public I mean they'll go through a public hearing and review process naturally, but the planning board will be able to look at these projects on a case-by-case basis, and if they feel that, you know, the use of whether it's on-street parking or available public parking is reaching a saturation point with these projects that come forward, then the town can take a look at the parking and look at different options for providing additional public parking. But as it stands now, as I stated, there is no evidence that there is a parking shortage in the downtown area. Yes, there is underutilized public parking, but there are measures that can be taken to remedy that situation. So parking is something that may need to be addressed at a future date. But again, the zoning is simply the foundation that allows the downtown to progress, and as development happens, it's something the town can re-examine.
I want to chime in a little bit on the parking. The perspective that leads to one to be concerned about that comes from an analysis that the tenants in these new apartments are going to be from the town of Stoughton. And frankly, some of the developments that have been built up recently in the downtown area have attracted younger single individuals and that have come from urban areas like Boston. They're coming out to the suburbs because they don't want the congested housing that exists in Boston. They want lesser rents. So you're thinking that thought is that people with two cars are going to downsize to a two-bedroom apartment and not want to get rid of their second car. But what you have to consider is that a lot of the demand for new housing is coming from new families or family units that are just beginning to form. Students leaving college, and a lot of those have come to the developments in Stoughton in the 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. In fact, I believe one of those buildings was a 1 bedroom only unit. So you're really the parking downsize requirement is suitable for that kind of a tenant. You need to look at it that the kinds of tenants are going to be mixed. They're going to be attracted to the lower rents that are in Stoughton. The lower cost of housing is the reason why I moved to Stoughton. And so I think that others, it's not unusual to think about the fact that other people will be moving out of other communities such as the city of Boston or Quincy, and that they won't require 2 vehicles because they already have a 1 car or a no car situation in their home unit.
Thank you, Joe. The other thing that will come to the forefront and people will hear about is the state's new draft guidelines for mixed use and multifamily development for MBTA communities. Now,
yes, I'm glad you're speaking about that because I think there's a great deal of confusion that this bylaw is being developed in order to satisfy state law.
Right.
You want to comment on on that?
So those draft regulations have just recently come out in January of this year. And so this bylaw has been in process for almost 3 years. And from what I understand, the thought of redoing the zoning in the downtown has been a thought in the town's mind since well before then, going back at least 10 years. So this bylaw was not drafted to satisfy the MBTA community guidelines. It was drafted with Stoughton in mind and the redevelopment of the Stoughton downtown in mind. It just so happens that the town was ahead of the curve in terms of satisfying the MBTA requirements that are being put forward. So this bylaw will satisfy the MBTA community guidelines in terms of allowing multifamily and mixed-use residential by right within an area of reasonable size within a half mile of our commuter rail station. So it will meet the guidelines, but that wasn't the intention of the bylaw. It just happened to be a fortunate coincidence. So I was asked at an informational session last night of town meeting members, hypothetically, what happens if the town does not approve this bylaw at town meeting? Well, quite simply, what will happen is by the end of this calendar year, December 31st, 2022, I will need to send in a copy of whatever bylaw regulations are on the books for this downtown area to the Department of Housing and Community Development for their review and review for compliance with their draft guidelines. Now, I know that this bylaw will satisfy their guidelines. I'm confident that it will, but they will ultimately make that decision. If this bylaw is not passed, I will have to send in what regulations the town currently has on the books, and I am just as confident that the bylaws that are on the books right now will not fully satisfy the MBTA community guidelines.
John, is there any financial punitive aspect
Absolutely.
of not
Yes.
complying with the spirit of
Yes.
the community's housing legislation?
And I'm getting to that, Joe. What will happen is once we hear back from the Department of Housing and Community Development, if this bylaw is not passed and we don't meet their guidelines with the bylaws that we currently have, we will get a response probably early to mid 2023 that we do not comply, at which point a clock will start ticking and we will have until December 31st of 2024 to come into compliance, full compliance with the MBTA community guidelines. If we do not do that, then we risk not being eligible for various grant programs that the state has and certain state funding, such as the MassWorks grants and also housing choice designation grants. Now, we have taken advantage of MassWorks grants with the Park Street sewer extension that is currently ongoing. We got a large MassWorks grant to help us with the construction of that project. So these are programs that the town has taken advantage of in recent years. And also there's speculation that this ineligibility may extend into other state funding programs such as Chapter 90 funding for improvement of roadways and also Chapter 70 funding that goes to the schools. Again, those are things that I'm hearing that may come to fruition, but I'm not sure they will, but it is a possibility.
And we don't know. For example, the master plan concept has become a strategic component of most of the community grants that have come out of the state. So they tend to give us, in some cases it's a requirement to be considered for such a grant, and in some cases it puts you ahead of other communities as you get so-called bonus points for having those studies in. But I would also like to mention that the state initiative, as opposed to the bylaw, is an objective, a target. It is not a legislative requirement.
Right.
The bylaw has to show that you could satisfy the bylaw. However, you're going to hear some people talk about some very large numbers for housing. And in order for that to happen, even with our complying bylaw, if it's passed, would literally require the razzing of almost everything that exists in that half-mile radius and all built up for housing. So the chances of that draconian doomsday scenario happening are slim to none. But what the state is looking for is that you provide the legislative and legal framework for increasing housing in your community. And that's what they're looking for. There will not be a head count for units that come out and say, well, you don't have X number of units, so you don't get these grants. But the bylaw has to provide the framework so that it could happen, not that it shall happen.
Right.
And that's a point that I'd like to make sure that our viewers understand.
It is not a production mandate, nor is there any indication that it's going to become a production mandate. It is simply showing the state that the town has the capability to produce within its zoning a certain amount of housing density, multifamily housing density, mixed-use housing density within this area within a half a mile of the commuter rail station.
And another point I'd like to say, if this bylaw were not to pass, one of the requirements that's in the bylaw that has expired was a passage of an extension of off-site parking, and this came about as a result of the Malcolm Parsons project. And the bylaw has an unusual provision in that it sunsets, and it sunsetted on December 31st of 2021, and we're back. That extended the ability of developers in the square to go to 1,300 feet from the corners of their unit, corners of the site. And as of today, a new application coming to the planning board will require that parking to be at 500 feet from the site. Now, again, just to remind you of something I said earlier in the program, even with that bylaw, there were no new projects of substantial size passed in the 2 years since that. Even the 1,300 liberalization rule was passed. So you can imagine with going back to the 500 foot radius that you're certainly not going to get more housing because of the challenges of the lot size and the ability to put parking on site. John, is there any other points that you want to talk about as far as, I know that we have a work plan that in your department as far as what zoning projects you're going to be tackling in the future?
Yeah, so we're already in the process of working on a zoning analysis for the Campanelli Parkway Industrial Park with the Park Street Sewer Extension coming in thanks to the work of the engineering department. It is going to enable these properties to maximize the extent of their properties without the need for a septic system. So we are looking at the zoning regulations, both uses and dimension regulations, to allow property owners in this older industrial park to modernize and expand their operations to increase revenue for the town, and to keep vibrant businesses in the town so they don't potentially relocate. So that's a key aspect. And as a complement to that, we're also going to look at the Route 27 area from the Stoughton city line up to Ash Street and look at the zoning in that area for a different purpose, to potentially look at mixed use and multifamily housing in that area. So those are two things we have coming up, and we also plan on starting to investigate a senior housing bylaw for something throughout the town to address the need for various types of senior housing, affordable senior housing in the town of Stoughton. So those are some of the things on the radar coming up here once we get past the Stoughton Center zoning.
Thank you, John. It's clear that this particular initiative has been kicking around for 10 years. And we also, it's not the only thing on our plates, as the town planner, John Charbonneau, has mentioned, that we need to address these other areas in town and not just make a multi-generational project of the square. So we thoroughly encourage you to contact us with any questions. John's office number is 781-232-9201. He can be found at the second floor in the engineering department. And we encourage you to contact your town meeting reps and become informed about this extremely valuable initiative that will be in front of us at town meeting. And we thank you for allowing us into your homes to be able to enlighten you on this important initiative for the town. And on behalf of the planning board, the planning department, and the town meeting, as a town meeting member, I would like to thank you for your attention and interest in this matter. Thank you and good day.